December 13th, 1941, 6 days after Pearl Harbor, every member of the largest Nazi spy ring ever uncovered on American soil has pled guilty or been convicted. The man who broke the case is being called the man who saved the country from the enemy within. It should be the peak of his story. It isn't. The FBI's own later history admits something strange about the case that made his name. Of every wartime sabotage investigation the Bureau ever ran, not one traced back to an actual act of enemy sabotage. The hero had no real enemy. But the power that triumph handed him would outlive the war by half a century. To understand how a hero with no real enemy ended up with that much power, you have to rewind 5 years, to a handshake at the White House. But first, you need to understand what the FBI actually was before any of this. It wasn't always a national power. It was 34 men and a memo. On July 26, 1908, an attorney general named Charles Bonaparte, a descendant of Napoleon's own family, signed a one-page order creating a small investigative force inside the Department of Justice. It had no name yet. It had no independent budget worth mentioning. It existed mainly so the Justice Department wouldn't have to keep borrowing agents from the Secret Service. Nobody in that room in 1908 imagined they were founding an institution that would one day hold the fingerprints of 100 million Americans. That is the story people think they already know. A scrappy little office that grew up through hard work, gangsters, and G-men. That story is dangerously incomplete. It skips the chapter that actually built the empire. The chapter with no trial, no headline, and no vote. Somewhere between a modest records office and the machine that shadowed presidents, this agency crossed a line Congress never drew and never approved. The handshake that became the biggest file cabinet in America happened in one room on one afternoon. Almost nobody in the country knew it had happened at all. For 16 years after Bonaparte's memo, the Bureau was, by most honest accounts, a mess. It had no consistent hiring standard. Agents were political appointees, friends of friends. Men handed badges as favors. It had been dragged through the mud by the Palmer raids of January 2, 1920. Federal agents rounded up more than 500 people in a single night and deported them without warrants. The Bureau that emerged from that scandal needed, more than anything, to look clean. And on May 10, 1924, the new reform-minded Attorney General, Harlan Fiske Stone, made a bet on a 29-year-old Justice Department clerk to fix it. Stone had a personal reason, too. He wanted the Teapot Dome corruption scandal scrubbed off the Bureau's reputation for good, and he needed someone with no political debts to call in. That clerk's name was John Edgar Hoover. The terms he set for taking the job tell you almost everything about the next 48 years. The Bureau must be divorced from politics and not be a catch-all for political hacks, he told Stone, his own condition for accepting the role. Stone agreed. For a few years, that bargain looked exactly like what it claimed to be, real reform. Hoover imposed background checks. He required legal or accounting degrees. He fired the political appointees who couldn't pass a basic competency test. By July of that year, the Bureau had begun building its identification division. It was a fingerprint exchange with state police departments. Quietly, it made the federal government the nation's record keeper for the first time. The numbers from those early professionalizing years are almost boring by design. That was the point. Uniform Crime Reports, a national system for counting offenses, arrived June 11, 1930. A technical laboratory, the world's first large federal forensics lab, opened November 24, 1932. On July 1, 1935, the Division of Investigation formally became the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 4 weeks later, its National Academy trained its first class of 23 police officers. Every one of these was a bureaucratic, unglamorous step. None of them, on its own, looks like the birth of a national power. But stack them together and you get something specific. An agency that, block by block, became the place every police department in the country had to go through. Then came the gangsters, and with them, guns. In 1932, Congress passed the Lindbergh Law, making kidnapping a federal crime, a direct response to the kidnapping and killing of Charles Lindbergh's infant son. 2 years later, after a string of shootouts left federal agents outgunned, Congress finally armed them and gave them arrest powers of their own. The trigger was the Kansas City Massacre of June 17, 1933. 4 law enforcement officers and a handcuffed fugitive named Frank Nash were shot dead in a train station ambush in front of a crowd of witnesses in broad daylight. The men responsible were people the Bureau had been tracking but couldn't legally stop with force of its own. Hoover used the killing to justify turning the Bureau into a war machine against what he called public enemies. By September 26, 1933, the legend had already outrun the facts. Machine Gun Kelly's surrender in Memphis produced a phrase that stuck to the Bureau forever. "Don't shoot, G-men." It's a wonderful line. It's also, by the FBI's own admitted history, probably not what happened. G-man was underworld slang for any federal agent long before that arrest. The more colorful version simply made for better headlines. That's not a quote from a witness. It's a label the Bureau let the country believe, because the myth was more useful than the truth. Now, with a professional workforce, a national fingerprint file, and a folk hero reputation for gunning down gangsters, the Bureau had almost everything. It didn't yet have the one thing that would actually make it a national power. It didn't have permission to watch its own citizens. That permission wasn't going to come from Congress. It was going to come from a private conversation in a White House drawing room, between 2 men who had already decided the country needed watching. Before we get to that room, it helps to know exactly who was in it, because none of what follows makes sense as policy. It only makes sense as character. John Edgar Hoover overcame a childhood stutter by talking fast. Classmates in Washington called him Speed. He lived with his mother in a house in Seward Square until she died in 1938, when he was 43, and he never married. He joined the Justice Department as a draft-exempt 22-year-old clerk during the First World War. Within 2 years, he was running the Palmer raids that nearly ended his career before it began. His motivation, as far as the record shows, was not greed and not spite. It was order, a genuine, almost obsessive belief that disorder itself was a kind of corruption. He believed a country left unwatched would eventually watch itself fall apart. A phrase later cited in federal opinions is widely attributed to him, though its precise origin is disputed. He is remembered for saying, "Justice is incidental to law and order." Franklin Delano Roosevelt was, by 1936, a paralyzed president running toward a second term and a coming war from a wheelchair the press corps had quietly agreed never to photograph. He preferred verbal instructions to written law whenever he could get away with it, a habit that made him, for Hoover's purposes, the perfect partner. His motivation was fear, specific and not unreasonable, fear of a fascist or communist fifth column organizing inside the United States while his attention was fixed on Europe. War broke out in Europe, and 3 days later, Roosevelt issued a directive. It ordered the Bureau to take charge of investigative work in matters relating to espionage, sabotage, and violations of the neutrality regulations. 8 months later, in May of 1940, he went further. He overrode the Supreme Court's own ban on warrantless wiretaps with a private memo. "I am convinced," it read, "that the Supreme Court never intended any dictum to apply to grave matters involving the defense of the nation." Read that twice. That is a sitting president deciding on his own authority which Supreme Court rulings applied to him. 2 more men complete the cast, and both prove the same point from opposite directions. William Siebold was a German-born, naturalized American diesel engineer who made the mistake of visiting his mother in Mülheim in 1939. Gestapo pressure came through her. Spy for the Reich, or she pays the price. Siebold came home and walked straight into the FBI. He became its first working double agent, running a fake spy office on Manhattan's 92nd Street, wired floor to ceiling with hidden microphones. A mother's safety converted into a nation's intelligence coup. Frederick Joubert Duquesne, the man whose network Siebold helped expose, was a Boer War saboteur and big-game hunter, decorated in 3 different armies. At 63, he was still running Nazi Germany's largest espionage ring on American soil. He liked to boast that he was the man who killed Kitchener, claiming credit for guiding the U-boat that sank the British Field Marshal's ship in 1916. Whether or not that boast was true, it tells you exactly the kind of man Hoover's Bureau was suddenly responsible for catching. And it tells you exactly the kind of mythology that made catching him so useful. Harlan Fiske Stone deserves a moment too, if only because he's the one character in this story who later had second thoughts. Stone was the reform attorney general who set Hoover's price of admission: professionalism, no political hacks, a clean bureau. But Stone went on to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. From that seat, he wrote opinions skeptical of exactly the warrantless methods his own protege would spend the next 2 decades perfecting. He built the machine's foundation, and he lived long enough to worry about what stood on top of it. Nobody listened to him either, which is worth remembering the next time this story gets told, as if only one person ever saw where it was heading. One more name belongs here, because his ending is the sharpest illustration of what all of this eventually cost. Herbert Haupt was 22 years old, Chicago-raised, a 1937 graduate of Lane Technical High School, and an American citizen by birth. Family pressure and ideology pulled him toward the Reich anyway. On August 8, 1942, he became the only United States citizen ever executed for collaboration with the Axis powers. He is the visceral cost sitting underneath every number in this story, not an abstraction, but a 22-year-old from Chicago in an electric chair. Every statistic in this story, the budgets, the staff counts, the fingerprint totals, is easy to read past. Haupt is harder to read past, and that's exactly why his name belongs here, instead of a footnote. He grew up 2 miles from where he died. That distance is the whole story, compressed into a single fact. By the time all of this converges, the reformer, the president, the double agent, the saboteur, the citizen who chose wrong, one thing is clear: the Bureau has stopped being a records office. And the something else it became started, like most quiet power grabs do, with a conversation nobody wrote down. On August 24, 1936, Franklin Roosevelt invited J. Edgar Hoover to the White House. What was said in that room exists today only in Hoover's own memo of the meeting, marked "absolutely confidential." There was no statute passed, there was no budget line created, there was no announcement to the press, no notice sent to Congress. Roosevelt asked Hoover, in private, to begin gathering intelligence on fascist and communist activity, foreign and domestic. Hoover said yes. That is the entire transaction. Name the moment, and it is almost embarrassingly small. 2 men, 1 room, 1 afternoon. The mechanism was a verbal instruction with no paper trail beyond Hoover's own private notes. The number is 0. 0 laws, 0 hearings, 0 congressional appropriations tied to the request. The judgment writes itself. Power granted without a law behind it is power that never has to be reviewed by anyone who granted it, and the impunity followed naturally. When questions eventually came, years later, Hoover's answer was always the same. The president asked for this, and the president wanted it quiet. No president wanted to be the one who admitted otherwise. 3 years later, the private handshake became something closer to public policy, though it still never became law. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. 3 days later, Roosevelt issued his directive by press release, making the FBI the lead investigative agency for espionage, sabotage, and neutrality violations. Name the mechanism: a press statement standing in for legislation. The Bureau's budget climbed from roughly $14 million in fiscal year 1941 to $25 million the year after. The judgment, national security, had become a category the executive branch could define for itself and expand for itself without ever justifying it to a court. And the impunity, nobody sued, because there was no statute to challenge. Then came the wiretap memo, and with it the last piece of the architecture. Roosevelt's private override of the Supreme Court's wiretap ban opened the door to warrantless surveillance under the vague, self-defined banner of national defense. 1 month later, on June 24, 1940, the Special Intelligence Service was created at Roosevelt's request. It was America's first foreign clandestine intelligence arm, and its agents fanned out across every country in the Western Hemisphere except Panama. By 1946, that single covert service had identified 887 suspected Axis spies, 281 propaganda agents, and 222 people smuggling strategic materials to the enemy. It had tracked down 30 saboteurs and 97 others working against American interests, located 24 secret radio stations, and seized 40 transmitters and 18 receivers. But nowhere in any of those figures is there a line item for congressional authorization, because none exists. Every one of those numbers represents a real operation, in a real foreign country, run by American agents. There was no treaty behind any of it, no congressional oversight committee, no public accounting of what it cost. An entire intelligence service operated for 6 years on the strength of one man's verbal request to another man he trusted. Not one line of legislation had ever created it. It simply existed because a president asked a bureaucrat to build it, and the bureaucrat did. Think about the shape of that for a second. An entire foreign spy service, with real agents in real countries running real operations against a real enemy, and its birth certificate is a request, not a statute. That is not how the history books usually describe the founding of an intelligence agency. It is, nonetheless, exactly how this one was founded. Running quietly underneath all of it was the Custodial Detention Index, a list of names the Bureau considered dangerous enough to round up the moment an emergency was declared. According to some accounts, that list may have included the sitting president's own wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. That particular claim rests on a single source, though, and deserves real skepticism rather than certainty. What isn't in dispute is that by July of 1943, the Attorney General had quietly questioned the list's legality. Hoover responded not by ending it, but by renaming it. The Custodial Detention Index became the Security Index overnight. The list didn't shrink. Only its name changed. A pattern, it turns out, this Bureau would repeat for the rest of the century. Now, watch what happens to the numbers once that architecture is in place, because the growth is the whole story. In January of 1940, the Bureau employed 2,432 people. By February of 1941, that number had grown to 4,477, with plans already underway to reach 5,588 by June. By the wartime peak in 1944, the Bureau employed more than 13,000 people. For a stretch in mid-1941, it was hiring 52 new agents every 2 weeks, alongside more than 160 new clerks and stenographers, and the fingerprint files that started as a criminal record-keeping system had, by then, become something closer to a national identity register. Prints were taken from draftees, from war production workers, from foreign-born residents. More than 100 million cards were processed by hand by 1946, against a total American population of roughly 132 million in 1940. By 1944, in other words, the federal government held the fingerprints of most of the living adult population of the United States. Picture that as a single room, file cabinets stretching floor to ceiling, city block after city block, every drawer a name. Almost none of those names had ever committed a crime. This is roughly the halfway point of the story, and it's worth pausing on the date that sits almost exactly at its center, December 13th, 1941. The line was there from the very first sentence you heard. Every member of Frederick Duquesne's spy ring, arrested and convicted, before the first American troop ship had even reached a European battlefield. Hitler's largest espionage network in the United States was already in federal custody before most Americans had finished processing that their country was at war. The handshake that became the biggest file cabinet in America had armed a machine nobody outside a handful of Washington rooms had ever been told to watch. And that machine was about to have its finest, most publicly celebrated hour. 6 escalation cycles brought the Bureau to this point. It's worth naming them cleanly before the story turns, because each one repeats the same shape. A name, a mechanism, a number, a quiet judgment, and then nothing, no consequence. First, the hire and the purge, in 1924. Hoover, a merit system, a bureau divorced from politics, and a legacy so clean no future president would dare audit him closely again. Second, the handshake in 1936. Roosevelt, a private verbal order, 0 statutes, and a precedent that power granted without law never has to be reviewed. Third, the statute-free authority of 1939 and 1940. The press release directive, the secret wiretap memo, a budget nearly doubling, and national security becoming whatever the executive branch needed it to mean. Fourth, the covert empire, the Special Intelligence Service and its 887 identified spies, built entirely on a president's request rather than a law. And now fifth, in 1941 and 1942, the triumph. 33 members of the Duquesne Ring convicted, more than 300 combined years of prison sentences handed down on a single day in January 1942. All 8 members of a second Nazi sabotage team under arrest within 2 weeks of landing on American beaches. Hoover called the roundup, in a line the Bureau itself would repeat for decades, the greatest spy roundup in U.S. history. With that phrase, he became untouchable. Not because anyone decided he should be, because nobody in Washington could think of a good reason left to say no to him. A man just credited with saving the country from Nazi infiltration is not a man anyone wants to be seen questioning. Hoover understood that leverage better than almost anyone else in government ever would, but every one of those 5 cycles was still, technically, defensible. Reform is defensible, wartime intelligence sharing is defensible, catching real Nazi spies is about as defensible as anything a government does. The 6th cycle is where the defense starts to crack, because the 6th cycle is about what happened after the spies were caught. On August 8, 1942, 6 of the 8 Nazi saboteurs from the 2nd Landing Team, Herbert Haupt among them, were executed at the District of Columbia jail. They'd been tried by a secret military commission that ran from July 8th to August 4th, with no appeal route available to the men inside it. The entire execution procedure took just over an hour for all 6 men combined, roughly 10 minutes each. 2 of the 8 were spared. George Dash had turned himself and the entire plot in to the FBI 6 days after landing on Long Island. He and his co-conspirator Ernst Berger were both granted clemency on Hoover's own recommendation. Within 3 years, the FBI's full-throated cooperation with a Hollywood studio produced The House on 92nd Street. It was a 1945 film dramatizing the Siebold operation, made with Hoover's blessing. Hoover himself appears briefly on screen. The Bureau hadn't just caught the spies, it had already started writing its own legend about how. In some cases, actual agents were cast to play themselves on screen. It blurred the line between the case file and the box office in a way no law enforcement agency had ever attempted before. But look at what the 6 cycles actually add up to, laid end to end. A hiring reform in 1924, a private verbal order in 1936. 2 press releases and a secret memo in 1939 and 1940. A covert foreign service built on a request, not a statute, by mid-1940. A publicly celebrated espionage takedown by the end of 1941, and a set of quiet executions, a renamed watch list, and a Hollywood movie by 1945. Every individual step, taken on its own, looks reasonable. Strung together, they describe something closer to a coup that never needed force, because nobody with the authority to stop it ever tried. It's worth being careful here. It would be easy to tell this story as a simple conspiracy, a single villain scheming his way to power while everyone else stood by helplessly. That isn't what the record actually shows. Roosevelt genuinely believed, with real justification, that fascist infiltration was a live threat. Hoover genuinely believed he was building the professional, disciplined agency the country needed. Congress, for its part, mostly wasn't lied to so much as it simply wasn't asked. That distinction matters, because it means the fix was never as simple as removing one bad actor. Even a Congress that trusted Roosevelt completely would still have been trusting an arrangement it never reviewed. Even a public that trusted Hoover completely never got the chance to vote on any of it. The failure here isn't one man's ambition, it's a system that made it structurally easy for enormous power to accumulate in a place no one was specifically watching. That failure implicates a lot more than one office in downtown Washington. Now for the sentence that changes how everything before it reads. Buried inside the FBI's own official history of its wartime sabotage cases is an admission the Bureau has never tried especially hard to publicize. Of every act of suspected enemy sabotage it investigated during the entire war, not one was ever found to be enemy-inspired. Every case traced back to something else: vandalism, personal grudges, teenage curiosity, industrial accidents dressed up as intrigue in the retelling. The enemy the machine had been built to fight, in the specific form of homegrown sabotage, essentially didn't exist. The machine stayed anyway. That should be where this story ends. A cautionary footnote about wartime paranoia outliving its own justification. It isn't. The same year the war ended, Harry Truman was 3 weeks into a presidency he never expected to hold. He wrote something in his private diary that reads less like praise and more like a warning nobody heeded. "We want no Gestapo or secret police," he wrote on May 12, 1945. FBI is tending in that direction. It would be 27 years before anyone in a position to act on that warning actually did. The apparatus built to fight spies who mostly didn't exist didn't disappear once the real war ended. It found a new justification almost immediately, and it kept the one asset that mattered most, the files. Not one president from Roosevelt through Nixon ever removed Hoover from office. The uncomfortable, well-documented explanation involves what Hoover kept on file. compromising material on senators, cabinet officials, civil rights leaders, and by some accounts even Roosevelt's own wife, made him more dangerous to fire than to keep. By 1945, the file cabinet that grew out of one handshake had stopped needing anyone's permission at all. What followed spanned 6 decades. Every stop on the timeline repeats the same shape as the last. The machine finds a new enemy, and nobody remembers to ask who authorized it this time. In 1943, the Custodial Detention Index was renamed the Security Index rather than dismantled, a legality concern answered with a new label instead of a new law. In 1946, the Special Intelligence Service was shut down and folded into a smaller legal attaché program. In 1947, the National Security Act created the CIA specifically to take foreign intelligence out of the FBI's hands. Hoover lost the world, but he kept the country, and the domestic surveillance apparatus he'd built stayed fully intact. Between 1950 and 1953, the machinery that had once hunted foreign saboteurs turned toward the Rosenberg case and the wider anti-communist prosecutions of the era. But it wasn't only headline cases that absorbed the Bureau's attention in these years. Thousands of quieter loyalty investigations into government employees, teachers, and union organizers who had never been near an embassy or a foreign agent ran on the exact same legal foundation the FBI had built to catch Nazi spies a decade earlier. By 1956, that same machinery had a name for turning inward: COINTELPRO. It was a program of domestic surveillance and disruption aimed not at foreign agents but at American citizens the Bureau considered dangerous to the existing order: civil rights organizers, anti-war groups. Eventually, just about anyone whose politics Hoover personally distrusted. The tools were the same tools built to catch Frederick Duquesne's spy ring 15 years earlier: wiretaps, authorized under the same vague national security language, files opened under the same self-defined authority. Not one new law was required to point any of it at an American citizen instead of a foreign agent. Between 1963 and 1968, that included the surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr. It was the custodial detention logic of 1939, applied without irony to a Nobel Peace Prize winner exercising a constitutional right to speak. On May 2, 1972, John Edgar Hoover died in his sleep at the age of 77. He had served 48 years and 8 presidents and never once faced an election, a term limit, or a serious threat of removal. 3 years later, the Church Committee hearings finally cracked open decades of Bureau abuses in public. In 1976, Congress passed the one reform the machine had never been able to avoid: a law capping any future FBI director to a single 10-year term. It was the first structural limit placed on the office in its entire history, and it arrived only after the man the limit was built around was already dead. But a 10-year term limit, written in 1976, does nothing to unwind the 68 years of precedent that came before it. It caps the next director. It does not undo what the first one built, but it does nothing to the underlying machinery. The wiretap authority, the fingerprint files, a definition of national security broad enough to cover almost anything a president decides to worry about, all of it stayed exactly where it was. And in 2001 and 2002, in the aftermath of September 11th, the loop that opened in that White House room in 1936 opened again. Expanded national security wiretap authority was granted quickly under a new banner. It carried the same basic promise that had justified every expansion before it. Trust us, this is different, this is necessary. We are all, every single one of us, still living inside the architecture that one private conversation built in an afternoon nobody wrote down. Every time the country has faced a fresh enough fear, it has reached for the same tool, built the same way, for the same unreviewed reasons. A man who arrived at the Justice Department as a 22-year-old draft-exempt clerk in 1917 outlived 8 presidents and left behind an agency that outlived the century that built it. That is the actual scale of what one handshake did. Not a scandal contained to one decade. Not a single villain undone by one committee hearing 30 years too late. A permanent piece of architecture, still standing, still expanding, every time the next crisis arrives to justify it. We built the room in 1936. We have been walking back into it, generation after generation, ever since. Each time, the door has looked a little more ordinary, a little more like something that was always supposed to be there. Nobody has ever published a full count of how many files the Bureau eventually held. Most researchers estimate tens of thousands of subject files, though the true total has never been fully disclosed by the agency itself. The handshake that became the biggest file cabinet in America is still, in a very real sense, being unsealed one document at a time. FOIA requests decades old still turn up material nobody outside a handful of Washington rooms was ever meant to see. Every new release is a small, procedural reminder of just how much of this was never supposed to be reviewable in the first place. If you've ever wondered why the question, "Who's watching?" so rarely gets a satisfying answer, here is where it starts. Not with a law, with the absence of one. If this kind of quiet, procedural history is the kind of thing you find yourself thinking about after a video ends, it costs nothing to subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you'd guess. And if you want to argue with any of this, whether Roosevelt was right to be afraid, whether any of it was avoidable, the comments are exactly the place for it. That's the conversation this channel exists for. What was actually inside the files Hoover kept, who was named in them, and how long it took investigators to force that door open, is a different story entirely. It starts with a Senate committee nobody expected to succeed, and with a question that took 30 years to get asked out loud: what, exactly, was in the file